Hi, I'm David Hackoff, Executive Director of NewFest, New York's LGBTQ film and media organization. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation around the film Real Boy. We're really excited about this conversation, and we are very excited to be partnering again with Peloton. Peloton has been a wonderful partner to NewFest over the years. They really live their values, and we are really pleased to be partnering with them to bring you this film around Trans Day of Visibility, which was yesterday. And we have a really wonderful moderator, Brooke Guinan. Brooke was the subject of the film Woman on Fire, which highlighted her journey as New York City's first trans firefighter. And we have the director and one of the subjects of the film here with us. So please enjoy this conversation around the film Real Boy.
Welcome so very, very much to this question and answer following the screening of Real Boy. We hope that you really enjoyed the screening. We're so excited to partner with Peloton for this fantastic opportunity to get this story out there. But right now, I want to jump right into the Q&A, and I want to introduce you to the other two members of this panel today that are going to be having this hopefully really wonderful and enlightening discussion. So I'd like to introduce you to Shalise Haas, director of the film. Welcome, Shalise. Just to tell you a little bit about Shalise. So Shalise is an Emmy award-winning documentary producer and a director based in Los Angeles. Her work has premiered at South by Southwest and the Tribeca Film Festival. And her 2016 film Real Boy, which you just saw, screened in 23 countries and earned 20 festival awards. Not only that, but it was also broadcast nationally on PBS's Independent Lens. Shalise has been a film independent documentary lab fellow, a working films fellow, and an impact partners producing fellow, and was a founding staff member of the National Oral History Project StoryCorps. Welcome, Shalise. We're so excited to have this conversation. And for those of you who saw the film, obviously you know the fantastic Joe Stevens. So welcome, Joe. Just again, a little bit more about Joe. You already saw him in the film, but Joe is a California-born singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist and a third-generation professional musician in a long line of restless, westward-moving souls. Between 2006 and 2012, Joe's first band, Coyote Grace, released 5 well-loved albums and toured with the Indigo Girls, Melissa Ferrick, and Girly Men. Joe released his first album, Last Man Standing, in 2014, and in 2015 began writing the music and lyrics for The Civility of Albert Cashier, a musical about a Civil War soldier who was born female and lived his life as male in the late 1800s. The musical had its opening run in Chicago in 2017, winning the Jeff Award for Best New Musical. So thank you both for being here for this fantastic conversation. How are y'all doing today?
Amazing. Thank you, Brooke. Thanks for such a wonderful introduction, and I'm really honored that you are moderating this.
Yeah, we're so excited to have this conversation. Just a tiny bit about me. My name is Brooke Guinan. I am the first openly transgender firefighter in the New York City Fire Department. And if you want to learn a little bit more about me, I identify as gender nonconforming. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her. And there was actually a documentary film about my experiences called Woman on Fire. So feel free to go check that out if you'd like to know a little bit more about me. But today is not about me. It is about these fantastic people. So I want to jump right in. This film came out in 2016, which means that you were filming even before then. So can we just get a tiny little update? I mean, we heard some of the bios about what's going on in your lives, but if you could just give us a tiny little update And then, of course, Bennett is not here today. So if one of you wants to maybe just give us a tiny little update on where Bennett's at the moment.
Joe, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Since the film, gosh, it's been a chunk. Ben and I, we did make a record of his tunes, and we toured for a little bit. And then I have since I got into the world of writing musicals, which was unexpected but fun. We have a couple that we're working on right now. The pandemic, of course, closed everything down, but still writing music, still driving around semi-aimlessly. Back in California. And Ben, I know he is out in Colorado now. He's at Naropa University, and he is studying to be, I think he's getting his MFT or Master's in Social Work or some something of that nature. So he's going into the social services to help people, and he's out in Colorado.
Thanks so much. And Chili's, how have you been doing since the film?
Yeah. Well, we had the tremendous privilege of being able to take this film to a lot of different places, and so for Joe and Ben to come and perform was a real pleasure. And subsequently, I have been primarily producing documentaries for other folks. I'm producing 3 feature-length films, and also am just about to release a short animated documentary that I directed. It's only 6.5 minutes long, but very different. The world of animation is very different from the kind of film that you just saw. And I am starting work on a new film that centers sort of a historical story that deals with queer utopias, and I'm really excited about it. So.
That sounds phenomenal. You're both definitely very, very busy still. So going back to the film and its origins, when did each of you first meet Bennett? And I guess what was the catalyst that ultimately led to this documentary happening in the first place?
Well, Joe, you should probably tell your story of how you met Bennett, because that was a couple months before I did.
We haven't done one of these in so long. I met Ben at a conference down in LA for sober youth. And of course, the queer people are looking for the other queers, and rarely is there another trans person. And there happened to be, he was speaking on a panel. And so I just went up to him and made friends, and he recognized some of my stuff online. And he said he wrote songs, and, he was 19 and I was 20, 31, 30, something like that. I saw, he was living in an apartment with his mom. They were arguing all the time, and he was struggling to kind of get his trans feet under him. And I was living in this big house in Sacramento, and I could tell that they maybe needed a break. And I offered, I was like, if you want to come up and stay, we can record music. We can, I don't know, do whatever, let things calm down. And he did. And he came up to Sacramento. We were doing a house concert at my house, and Shalise was there filming the other guy in the show. And from there, we made friends and things happened. So that would have been
2012, I think.
12, wow.
Yeah. And so I had known Joe and known Joe's music for a number of years, was a big fan. We had met sort of through community briefly, but didn't know each other well at that time. And I was really interested in stories about chosen family inside queer community. It's something that's been really important to me and something that I think about a lot. And so when I met Joe and Bennett, there was this clear, they had only met a few weeks prior, but there was just this love and it was friendship, but it was also because Joe is so much older than Bennett, and Bennett was really just beginning his transition. I think there's ways to look at it as mentorship, but it's also this really deep, the way we're able to sort of see and be seen by people who have similar lived experiences. And I think the queer community does that uniquely well. And so initially the film was going to, or initially what I was interested in and sort of where the film began was an exploration of their friendship and their relationship and this kind of building of queer family. And so I asked both of them if I could come, do an interview or films. I didn't know what the film would be about, but I asked if I could come and film with them. And both of them, because they didn't know any better, said, of course.
Like, all right, that sounds good.
Come on down. And they didn't know they were in for 5 years of me following them around with the camera.
Chili's popping up in the back seat.
Exactly. But yeah, so that was how we met, and the film really evolved over time, I think, in a variety of ways. But that was its genesis, and to their credit, they, kept saying yes. So I'm super grateful for that, and we've all become very close through that process and built relationships of our own that were really important.
It's so interesting to hear that Joe, you and Bennett had not really known each other for that long, because the relationship in that film comes across as so very, very deep. It seems like you've been friends for such a long time. And so that's interesting to hear.
The film does cover about, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
That's kind of how it felt. And what Shalise said, there, especially I think for trans people, there's not, you don't just run into older trans people who can show you some tips every, it's a real rare thing. And you sort of just, you offer what you have on the spot because it's needed. But.
Yeah. One of the other things that struck me about the film is for a film with not an extremely long runtime for a feature length, there's so many moving parts. There's so many stories being told, right? There you have Joe and you have Bennett, and then you have both of their families, and then you have Bennett's roommate who's also going through the transition process, and then his family, his mother comes into it. There's so many people that are in this film with, granted, interconnected and similar stories, but also, they each have their own different story to tell. So, Shalise, as a filmmaker, sorry, my dog's shaking her collar. So as a filmmaker, how did you balance all of those stories? And did it come out exactly as you had expected it to, now that you have hindsight of it being 6 years later? And were there any bits of story looking back now that you wish you had more time to tell?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really wonderful question, and one that we as filmmakers grapple with all the time, right? Because this isn't an historical film where you know what the ending is before you start the beginning, and I think always a challenge for documentary filmmakers. I think that as the film came together, and we spent about a year in the edit, as I mentioned, it was initially going to be the Bennett and Joe show, right? It was going to be road movie, buddy movie, kind of really just about that singular relationship. And once I met Susie, and once she sort of slowly started to let me in, even though she and Bennett were both in a really tough place, and it wasn't easy for her to say, yeah, come in and film me at my most vulnerable, uncomfortable time of my life. But we built a relationship over a very long period of time, and it became clear that the relationship that had the most evolution, right? I came in pretty early on, and even though Bennett and Susie couldn't necessarily see it, I felt like I had a lot of faith that they were going to be okay. Like, I could see that this was a family that was going through stuff, right? And it was hard in the moment, but I could see how much they both loved each other and just wanted to be seen by one another. And I had faith that if we just were patient enough, that relationship would transform into something really beautiful. And from, as a filmmaker, right, that's the thing you want to follow, is where is the change, where is the evolution, who is growing, who is changing. And I think the thing that for me is important about this film is oftentimes in films that center someone going through transition, the focus can often be on that person's transition, right? And for me, that was what was kicking up all the feelings for everybody, including Bennett. But it wasn't the transition itself that was nearly as interesting as the evolution of the relationships to one another, to everybody personally, right, to themselves and to each other. And so my goal was to really follow those relationships. And I had to, Bennett is at the center of it. And then his relationship with his mom is pretty primary. His relationship with Joe is really important, and his relationship with Dylan. So all those are kind of constellations outside of kind of that primary relationship. And then the parents, the other moms, I think were helpful to give perspective, because where Susie was is where she was, and where Joe's parents were by the time we were filming was like
10
years.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they were, as Joe, you can probably share that it's not like your parents were these sort of like
it wasn't
perfect
like
and light. But to show where you could be headed in your relationship. And Dylan's mom was just like, it's all great. So I think there was a way in which everybody played a specific role, and the important thing was figuring out what's the primary relationship we're following, the primary story, and then how do all of these other characters in the relationships between each other help reflect and sort of amplify or contrast to the central story.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic way to put it. And it actually almost answers my next question too, which, being a film about transition, you had said most stories focus on the person who's going through the transition. But I've heard it said that, we don't transition in a bubble, right? Everyone in our life sort of transitions with us, whether they want to or not. If they stick with us in our life, they also have to make a transition, whether it's as simple as changing pronouns or whether it's, depending on our relationship to that person, whether they're a romantic partner, whether they're a family member, whether they're a friend, a colleague. There's all kinds of different ways that those around us are sort of forced into this transition with us. And so we see that with Bennett and Joe and Dylan's mothers being, all having such very distinct points of view on the transition of their children. Do you see any other ways that family members transition with you? And maybe even more than that, what ways do you think that your family members don't experience the transition the same way that you do, that maybe makes it so much harder for them? We specifically saw Bennett's mother having a big difficulty with telling other family members, and the concern that would come with what they would think of her as a mother or what they would think of her child. So what ways do you think that transition is similar for your family going through it with you? What ways do you think that it's very, very different? And maybe Joe, you have some really great insights on this maybe.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of two things. My younger brother was, if I was 22, he would have been like 17 or so. And I remember coming to visit him, and he said, so I told my friends, my sister is now my brother. So when I say my brother, I mean Joe, not Robert. Okay. And all of his little teenage friends were like, okay. They didn't know what to say. And that's when it really clicked to me that he actually has to tell people. Otherwise, they won't know what he's talking about. And that really, I was like, oh, and he has to do that frequently and probably more than once. Oh, and it really started to. And another one was, I was with my mom, and it was one of her choral things. So all these parents are in the room. They all know that she has 2 sons and a daughter. And I'm standing there, and this woman is like, so where's your daughter today? And my mom was like, she's at school, and we had a good laugh about that. And that was another, she had to tell or not tell all of those people. I almost felt like it was more people than I had to tell. And that really was like, oh, okay, this is everybody's transition. And to say for, a woman to have said, I have 2 sons and a daughter, to say I have 3 sons, that's a transition in who your world. And so I really was able to see their transition through things like that. One thing that I feel like will never, they can only observe and love and have compassion for, but not true empathy, is the experience of gender congruity or what, or whatever that word is. They, and that's why like trans mentorship is so important, is for someone to have the same body growing up experience, like the puberties that you went through and all that stuff. Like there's a bond there that you don't really know how strong it is until something's off about it. Like I share this really strong history with women because I know how that feels for your body to develop in that way. And it doesn't make me all of a sudden, transitioning didn't all of a sudden make me totally understand how boys grow up. Like that's not how I grew up. And so like those relationships with my father, like a son to my father and a son to my mother, they'll never be non-trans, influenced. And they don't, they can only look and love me and see that it's true for me, but they'll never know what it's like to have your gender not match your identity. And that's something I can only identify with trans people.
Yeah, I definitely experienced something similar with my parents as well. And that experience of, them being able to sympathize in a lot of ways, but not necessarily be able to empathize with exactly that feeling of just, not feeling home in your own skin.
And why it's so important and that's, I hope, in being there for Bennett, I knew I was also being there for Susie, and that I could talk to her in a way that, that only I could talk to her. And just like, I know that my parents visibly started to ease up when they saw me get happy. And Ben was saying, he was still not quite happy yet. And he was suffering. He was having a really hard time. And so just for Susie to say, like, your kid can be comfortable and happy, and you won't really know until you see it.
Which turned out to be very much true. Mm-hmm. And I think she was so grateful for you, Joe, and your, right? Because you were so clearly happy. You were so clearly who you were, and you could talk to her without, throwing a teenage temper tantrum, and you didn't have all the baggage of being related to each other. And she was like, well, if you turn out like Joe, I guess that's not so bad, right? So I think that it was a very unique and special relationship there too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was fairly antagonistic to my parents as well. I was very impatient, and I was hurting. It sucked. It was not a fun time. But so I also could kind of go through with Susie again and treat my mom how she maybe should have been treated.
It's funny because they called, going through sort of your transition, your second adolescence. Mm-hmm. But for trans people, a lot of the times, the first time you go through your adolescence, you want it to stop, or you want it to go as slow as possible. You just want to make it go away. Whereas with your second adolescence, when you're transitioning, it's exactly the opposite most of the time. It can't go fast enough for you. You want it to be over in the other way. You want to finish. You want to jump forward. And so I think that probably we saw a lot of that with Bennett. Just there was a lot of impatience. There was a lot of wanting for it to be, further along.
Yeah. Like when I came out to my parents, I wanted them so much to know, like, that it was like the most joyful thing that I ever to find out that you could actually transition and be okay and have friends and do that. Like I came to them with like the most joyous news that I've ever heard in my life, and they were hesitant, and it was hard to I wanted them to know how much that meant to me, that I could do this, and it had to take time.
I definitely want to. I'm sorry, Shaylee. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I definitely wanted to touch on, we're talking about a lot of the joys now, but I did want to touch, at least momentarily, on the fact that, Joe, for you were watching someone go through all of these things that you had gone through already. And while there were plenty of joys, there's also a lot of emotional turmoil that comes with being trans, going through transition. Shalise, I'm sure you saw a lot of that in filming these stories. And Joe, I'm sure you sort of had to experience a lot of that over again with Bennett. And then on top of that, you were dealing with your own struggles in the film. And so, Shalise, what was it like for you to sort of be watching all of these struggles and sort of have to remain behind the lens to a certain extent as a director? And Joe, what was it like for you to be watching Bennett go through all of these things, reliving them yourself, and then dealing with all of your own sort of struggles at the same time?
I'm going to let Joe go first because I think that's, unless you don't want to, Joe.
Will you go? I had to think about that for a second.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm going to sort of tangentially, because, I think it's important to recognize that I am not trans myself. I do not have a lived experience of being trans. I don't, as Joe was saying about his parents, right? I don't have that lived experience. And as a queer person who is partnered to a trans person who is deep in community, I also felt like this is my, Joe and Bennett, I wasn't a filmmaker coming in trying to be a fly on the wall, right? I wasn't trying to say, I know what this experience is like. And so I think we had lots of conversations amongst us where I tried to sort of make it clear to both of them and to Susie, right? Like, I am not telling the truth of your story. I never could. The only person who could ever do, and no other trans filmmaker could tell your personal truth. But I am seeking to do this through my lens in all of the ways that I come to this, and with as much kind of collaboration as possible, but also just relationship. Because to me, I think, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, Brooke, but I think that it's important to be like, it was hard because I wasn't just coming to sort of these like people who I didn't know. These were people I cared about very deeply. And I think Joe, with your permission, like Joe and I are very close, have been for many years. And there's a lot of relationship with both Bennett and Joe, and for that matter, Susie, that took place off camera that was about, so there were definitely times when I was like, am I wearing my filmmaker hat today? Am I wearing my friend hat today? Am I wearing my, like, what hat am I wearing today? And while that could be complicated at times, I think without it, the film would be very different, because the intimacy that we have is, I think, something that can be felt in watching the film. So hopefully that sort of answered your question, Brooke.
It did, and as I said before, you definitely felt that intimacy, definitely with Bennett and Joe, and with all of really the, I don't want to say characters, but all of the subjects in the film.
Thanks,
Joe,
for that.
You want to have your turn?
I mean, I think like that speaks to how comfortable and open we were able to be in the film, and we live interesting lives. Like, we are, I'm rarely in one place for very long, and I change my mind at will. And Shalise, to call up and be like, so where are you going? And we're going to go to Tucson for like 10 days. And can I fly in and just jump in with you guys? And then I'll drive back with you. And yeah, okay. And it's like 2 guys and a dog and a filmmaker in the back of the van. And to even, to like, I like my flow, and then things that disrupt my flow. So just to let somebody into those, parts of my world, and is, I think part of why the film is so cool is you get to see, the insides of people's lives. And watching Ben go through a lot of those struggles was interesting. He was going through it just a couple of years earlier than I was, which I think generationally, it's interesting how transition becomes more accessible. And I knew that the things he was going through were temporary, but when I was where he was at, there was no YouTube channels with trans people telling you how it is. There was a Yahoo listserv, that, you know, and that's how I found the doctor in Seattle who saw all the trans people. Like there was no older trans guys or anybody who'd been in transition longer than we had. So we just were all figuring it out ourselves. And I was so impatient, and I was sad, and I was grieving for the time that I felt like I lost. And I was, you know, and I was fighting with my parents, and I, you know, there were so many unknowns back then, and there were at least fewer unknowns for Ben. And, you know, I've said this before, but like, you get to sort of minister to your younger self and treat yourself how you know, would have liked to have now that you know. And so it's, you know, it's self-healing in a lot of ways. So to see him, you know, it hurt me to see him struggle, but I also just knew that it was temporary. And I also, you know, so you walk a line between, you don't want to diminish what he's feeling, but, you know, but so you sort of bring promise, I guess. And then, and then my own struggles on it, you know, like, wanting to be a good example, wanting to be, you know, like all of that. And then sort of knowing that there was a film going on, which like Shalise and I were also very good at, like, all right, we are friends right now, talk. And now we are, you know, kind of co-collaborators on this project, and we could switch those gears pretty easily. And there wasn't a lot of bumpiness or awkwardness in there. You know, but then there one time where Shalise was coming for an interview, and I was like just hung over in bed, and I had, you know, I was not prepared, and I was like, you don't have to come if you don't want to. Like, there might be a better time. And then she's like, well, I'd still like to if I could. And I looking at these beer bottles on the floor, and I was like, I could move those, or I could leave them there. I don't know, maybe, you know, like the choice of whether to like cover those struggles. And I decided to just leave them there. You know, I didn't go out of my way to like show my dirty laundry, but it was there. And if it becomes helpful for someone, then it's worth it. So that, I guess with my own struggles, that was my mantra. I was just like, well, authenticity is what can heal people. And if I just throw it out as authentic, maybe it'll be helpful.
Well, it's also very much, you know, they say growing up, you get to a certain point where you realize your parents are just human too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this film shows that our parents are just human too. But not only that, but it shows that even our mentors and the people that we look up to, they're human too, right? Mm-hmm. Like, no one is without struggle. And actually, right now, it looks like we have an audience question. So I'm going to jump into that. We have Oliver Warfield, who says, it was interesting how the film focused so much on very close relationships and did not focus on Ben's thoughts on more public interactions. What informed that choice?
Yeah, that is it's a really good question. And I think a few things informed that choice. One is that for me as a filmmaker, the things that move me are intimate personal relationships. That what I was interested in was the evolution of relationships with those closest to us, and the complexities and the messiness, but also the importance of that. And you know, I don't know if you can speak to this, Joe, but my experience of Bennett in that moment is also that he really was much more, not that he didn't have thoughts about public things, but he was also 19 years old. And he really was much more interested in what was going on with himself and his mom and the people, you know, than he had, you know, very political things to say, but kind of from the perspective, you know, he was a 19-year-old with like thoughts and feelings about the world, but they didn't feel as...
It's not what he spent most time thinking about.
No.
And transition can be a very like tunnel vision process. You're looking at your own body, and it kind of you have to sort of let it take over your life. But yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I will say the other thing to me was that this film was not ultimately ever intended to be a film about transition, even though on the surface you'd think it was. or even about being trans, which it clearly, those are clearly things that are, in the film. But I think what I heard from a lot of people in the years since the film has come out is that, and I'm grateful for this, is that there are people whose lived experiences are very similar to Bennett's or very similar to Joe's, who felt seen and who felt like this really feels like a lot what my life feels like. And there are people whose lived experiences are very different from theirs, right? There's a million experiences, for trans folks, for queer folks, for any identity you might have. You're not going to have a monolithic experience. And so there were certainly people who felt themselves reflected, but there were also people who weren't trans, who didn't have a trans kid, who just felt, oh my God, I know what that's like when you want your mom to approve of who you are and what you do and really see you. Like, I wanted my mom to see me because I wanted to be an artist and she wanted me to be an accountant, and that by being able to connect with the quality of what was happening in the relationships more than the substance, right? Or the facts of what was happening. And so I think a relationship, or like more focus on what's going on in the world in terms of trans identity was more outwardly focused in a way that was, and those films are great, but to me, this was what
and that changes so fast too. Like what's the current state of trans people in the world is like every 2 years, it's almost a different landscape. Like it seems,
I feel like I need to check in every 2 days sometimes.
Right. What are the new identities that we can choose from?
So my next question and my last question, probably tying in that we just had an audience question, is, you said your bio said that this film has screened in 23 countries. It's been in so many festivals, won all kinds of awards. You've all been different places with it. And you all have very public lives where you're traveling all the time. So what are some of the things that you have experienced being with this film in different places? What have been some of the reactions? Is there anything that really has stuck with you from a screening or an interaction with someone who had seen the film?
We did get to travel quite a bit with this film, and we didn't get to go everywhere where it screened, but like, I'm just so grateful that I got to go to where I got to. Australia, we got to go to Europe. And there's one that always pops out in my head. And I was in Dundee. It's a little town in Scotland, a smaller city. And it was a smaller screening. And it was, a community center. And there were sort of scattered people in the audience. You never know why people are there. That's what was always so interesting too, is, you get this group of people and you don't just wander into a screening of Real Boy because you saw it in the paper. Like, you have some sort of reason that you like are coming to see it. And this older couple, they might've been in their 70s, came up to me after that screening in this small town in Scotland, and their son-in-law was transitioning to female, their daughter's husband, and they didn't know what to do. So they were adults. They had been married for a while. I don't know if there was kids, and like, it was another way that like it clicked how many different ways that there are to experience a trans person, whether you're their father, their brother, their friend, their in-laws, all these different ways that people go through transition. And, he asked for my advice, and I'm like 30 something, from California, who has every resource available to me for support groups, or like, imagine a support group and it exists somewhere in California. And these are like very, rural people from this small area in Scotland grappling with the same issue, but their world and their dynamics seemed like crazy far apart from ours. And they were so desperate for some sort of answers or community of some kind that they come to a screening where they had rainbows on the announcements, this little straight couple, and they come to a screening and they ask me a question about it. And that sort of just spoke to me about the nature of how badly we need connection and community about from all angles, from everybody. You know, and I don't even remember what I said. I just sort of blubbered some some generic answer, but that just shows to me the intensity of the need for connection and mirroring. So that's one that sticks out to me a lot.
And Shalice, what about you?
Yeah, I cannot tell you how grateful I have been that we have been able to having a festival or having a film at a festival is so lovely. Winning awards feels great, but there's nothing that feels better than being able to connect with people who said, this was so important to me, right? Mm-hmm. Either the film or being able to connect with Joe and with Bennett. And I think the ones that stand out to me most are also the places kind of that you would least expect, right? Joe and I did a tour through the mid-Atlantic, right? We're in Western Pennsylvania, like
whole
deep,
country, yeah.
Very, quite hostile still to LGBTQ people. And some of the screenings that we had with people and people who showed up and said, we can't, our queer group has to be secret on Facebook because we can't be public about it. There was a screening that we did in Dublin. Only like 9 people came to the screening at a festival. And here I was as the filmmaker being like, it's not full enough. It's so sad. People are coming to the screening. And I got 2 letters after that screening. Like out of 9 people, there were 2 letters that were some of the most potent. Joe, would you mind? Sorry. Some of the most potent that I had, I keep them to this day. And one was a trans guy who said, I have looked for a reflection of my experience. I've watched every YouTube video. I've watched every documentary I could. Like I've been looking for a reflection, and they always seem sensationalized and focused on how much pain and suffering there is, or focused on surgery or whatever. And this film put out into the world what I feel inside but couldn't articulate. And I ran home and I told my wife and I said, we have to see, there was just, it was, I feel honored by that. There was an older lesbian woman who came to that same screening who wrote and said, I realized that I've really had an issue with trans people, right? Queer people can be transphobic too. And she was an older lesbian who really just didn't get it and felt resistance and watched the film and wrote me this beautiful letter saying, I feel like I understand. Like my resistance melted. It's like gave me access to something and I can relate completely. And I don't know why it was that I had such a hard time seeing, my experiences and trans people's experiences together. So, and one other thing I'll say, if I may, is that we did spend a lot of time with a group in Northern California, Gender Spectrum, building a toolkit. So if anyone wants to use the film for educational purposes or, needs resources, it has a lot of resources. It has sort of like workshops we have a special one for churches, schools, adults. But to the extent that the film can continue to be one of supporting, making an impact and changing hearts and minds, then I think I'd be grateful for any way that people could access that. So you're welcome to access it at realboymovie.com, and it's just free downloadable online.
Thank you so much. Those resources hopefully will be very helpful to people. So I want to thank both of you for this wonderful conversation. Being that yesterday was the Transgender Day of Visibility, I think it's really important that we keep centering trans folks and trans voices and trans stories. I think you said before, Shalice, that, there is no one trans story. There is no one voice, that all of these experiences of trans people are very different. And so thank you for putting all of these stories into the ether for people to sort of pick up on and move with. Joe, I think you said it great in the end of the film. I think it's a great way to close out that you had said that the transition body part, certainly, it's undeniable, but it also has a social, emotional, and mental part that people don't see all the time. And so I want to thank you all, the audience, for joining us today for the screening of this film, Real Boy, and for joining us in this conversation, and for getting some insight into the social, emotional, and mental parts of the trans stories of the people that live in this world. So I encourage you to maintain connections with NewFest and find more stories and learn more about the ways in which trans people live all around us, and how we can be more knowledgeable about those stories and make the lives of trans people better in this world. And now I think we're going to jump back to David Hackoff if he is here. And David?
Yes, thank you so much, Brooke. We have hopefully sorted out those technical difficulties. Thanks for bearing with us at the front end of this conversation. And thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. And I was really, it's such a beautiful film, and I was really moved by the way, Joe and Shalise, that you spoke about it, particularly at the end. And I think Brooke made this connection, yesterday being Trans Day of Visibility, and Joe and Shalise both talked about the importance of connection, of mirroring, of representation. That's really at the foundation of what we do at NewFest. We really believe that that seeing ourselves and members of the LGBTQ community on screen can open minds and open hearts and change lives, and even in some cases save lives. So really grateful for Joe and Shalise for being here to talk about this film. And thank you so much, Brooke, for so thoughtfully moderating this conversation. Thank you again to Peloton. We love partnering with Peloton. It's really it's a company that really has tremendously strong values, and we're so grateful for their support throughout the year. And we hope to be back with you again soon, sharing more stories and creating more opportunities for connection. Have a good afternoon, everyone.